Now in here you can see a graph showing the temperature versus the time, and you can see that about 13,000 years ago we started to come out of a glacial period, and during that period there was a particular increase in temperature, quite strange, then a little cooling down significantly here called the Young Dryas cooling, and then we came out of that until we reached the optimum period that we are now, which is called the Holocene period, where man started to settle. What you can see is that there was a huge jump in temperature up to the modern period, and then at that time the temperature oscillated, but the overall trend is a downward trend in the temperature of our planet. What is quite sure is that sooner or later, maybe in 1,000 years, maybe more, nobody knows, we are going to go back into a glacial time, so into a period of really cold time. Now, if we look back in time, well, you can see that the temperatures were actually quite high compared to our modern period, for which there are so much alarmism going on. To take an example, the Roman optimum period, this is a drawing showing you Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephant. He was able to do so at that time simply because he didn't encounter any ice or any snow. Nowadays, if you want to do that, you would be hard-pressed to succeed for the simple reason that the Alps actually contain enough snow and will block you to go over them, in contrast to what Hannibal did. The fact that he was able to do that at that period indicates that at that time, the temperature was actually higher than the one that we have encountered nowadays. Another period which was a nice and warm period was the so-called medieval warm period. This brought a lot of prosperity to European countries. This is also the period where the Vikings moved to Greenland and settled in Greenland, and they could grow crops, and they had sheep and cows and everything. And then, as the time went by, then the temperature again went lower and lower, and we entered a rather dark age called the Little Ice Age period at which the temperatures fluctuated but were usually colder than nowadays. They were so cold that sometimes that the Seine River and the others were actually frozen on quite a large thickness. Market was being held even on the Thames at that time, and glacier advanced significantly. They get very close to certain places, like in that picture, when the Alpe Glacier was going to engulf this little church shown over there. Nowadays, the temperature is going up again, but it's not at all as high as it used to be in that optimum period, for the simple reason that we are discovering regularly remains of the settlements of the Vikings, and I cannot believe the Vikings dig their houses under the snow or the ice cover. So that means that it was much warmer at that time before the period where actually cold times settled in again. Now, this was recognized at the early time by the IPCC. Huber-Lamb, who was the first director at that time of the unit at the University of East Anglia, drew exactly the same map, and he showed that the modern time where we are here, the temperatures are actually lower than during the medieval warm period. This was a big problem because you cannot get money, you cannot get finance, you cannot scare people if you are trying to let them know that this is an abnormally high temperature as compared to what was before. And therefore, people among the climatology community have started to worry about this, and one of the conclusions they came up is that they had to get rid of the medieval warm period. This was done by Michael Mann, who produced the hockey stick, the infamous hockey stick, and that was actually shown as being completely erroneous at the time. So people are starting to scare other people in order to continue having funding or in order to continue pushing for certain agenda. Now, what are we talking about when we discuss about temperature of the Earth, we are talking in fact about temperature anomaly. And the graphs that people regularly display looks like this one, in which you can see a gradual increase in temperature up to our modern period. Now, if you compare the temperature in 1880 to the temperature in 2016, the difference is about 0.7 degrees over a period of 134-35 years. That means a whopping 0.005 degree increase per year, which is really, really scary. I'm making a joke here. Now, thinking about it, on the same day, at the same moment in our planet, if you're in the middle of the desert, temperature can average up to plus 60 degrees. At the same time, in Antarctica, the temperature can be as low as minus 80 degrees. That means on our planet, even in the same day, temperature can be different by 140 degrees. And yet, life continues, and we are being scared by a 0.7 degree increase. This is completely ludicrous. Here is another way to show this. In blue, you can see the variation of temperature, an increase up to 1930 or so, a decrease up to the 1960, 1970, and then again an increase in temperature. Notice that carbon dioxide, which is this green line, is increasing in a gradual, monotonous way. And while the temperature went up in here, CO2 increased slightly. However, while it went down here quite significantly, CO2 kept increasing at the same monotonous rate. That means that there is no correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. If there is no correlation, that's a simple rule, there can be no causality whatsoever. What is worse is when we look at that period in here. During about 20 years, the two curves seem to correlate with each other. And now, as soon as we reach 1998, the curve breaks down again. Because since that period, for over 18 years, the temperatures have been flat or even slightly decreasing. During that time, CO2 has continued to increase at the same rate. So again, that means that there is utterly no correlation between the two. What is worse is while the temperatures have not increased during this 30 years period, the amount of CO2 we have released amount to about 1/3 of all the CO2 released by man since the industrial period. This is not only true for a few years, this is also true for a more longer period. This is work done by Ole Umlum. You can see in blue the increase in temperature. And as you can immediately visualize, while the temperature of the planet increases in blue, CO2 in green increases with a delay. And that lag is about 8 to 11 months. So on a yearly, multi-yearly, decadal basis, temperature increases and then CO2 is produced. A consequence can obviously not be a cause of a phenomenon. Even on a secular basis and millennium basis, these are temperature data in black and CO2 data measured from ice cores drilling in different stations, for example, Sipple Station. And you can see here in black the increase in temperature, and then in red the CO2 increase that followed with an 800 to 1,000 year delay. So clearly, and despite what Al Gore has said before, CO2 is a consequence of temperature increase and not a cause for temperature increase. More interesting is this work by Murray Selby. You can see that the curve from 1990 to 2000 of the increase in fossil fuel emission of CO2 emission went up in a steady state, and then since about 2000, the slope increased quite dramatically. Well, the amount of CO2 equals to the integral under that particular slope. If you remove the amount, the blue colored integral from there, you have this pinkish color here, and what is left, what is overproduced from 2000 to 2013 is the red colored area. And that amounts to an increase of more than 200% of carbon dioxide. However, if you look at the overall CO2, this is man-made CO2, if you look at the changes in the overall CO2 of our planet, as measured, for example, in Mauna Loa, you see that during the first period, in blue in here, you can get the integral that goes slightly, this is the slope. During the second period, where the human production increased significantly, the slope actually didn't change whatsoever. If the slope change was so minuscule, that means that human participation in CO2 release is actually extremely small. So small, it's actually immeasurable. Climatology, in that respect, is the only science I know in which, as the theoretical background diverges more and more from the measured data, people are more and more confident that their theory is correct. This is amazing. I've never seen that anywhere else in any science whatsoever. People are also telling you that the poles are melting and therefore we have to limit our production of carbon dioxide and that poor polar bears are going to die because of human activity. It turns out, in fact, that this is a lot of advertisement by certain ONG organizations, among them WWF. In 1970, the polar bear population was about 5,000 individuals. They were very low because people hunted them a lot for fun, but laws were passed where people could not hunt polar bear any longer. Since then, the population rose between 30,000 to 35,000 individuals. That means a whopping 7 times increase in the population of polar bears. So these animals are far from being extinct. They are actually increasing in size and enjoying themselves a lot. It is said that scientists who were actually monitoring the health and the amount of polar bears in this region of the Arctic lied in only to satisfy public demand, and we know exactly who the public are, and these are some organizations like WWF and others who need money, and the way to get money is obviously to scare people. The other thing is that people are being told that the Arctic sea ice is disappearing, and they are being showed with this average monthly sea ice extent starting somewhere between 1979 and so, and the very dramatic slope showing you the decrease in sea ice. In fact, if you go back in time and you want to have satellite data, the NASA will tell you that there was no satellite data before 1979. This is not true. This graph comes actually from the NASA itself, and you can see that they monitored sea ice as early as 1970. And you can see that at that time, the amount of ice in the North Pole was actually much lower than the amount of ice we are observing nowadays. It's quite clear that if you start in 1979, the sea ice has simply declined over the years. However, if you start in 1973, for example, it has in fact increased. Clearly, you cannot say that the Arctic has decreased in size depending upon the judicious choice of when you want to start your graph. Arctic sea ice has declined, as Vincher has shown it, but it has declined when we started to leave the little ice age, which is normal because we entered a warmer period. And it's clear that it's slowing down now, and for the past 10 years, more or less, there has been no real loss in sea ice. It's actually been reconstructing itself and probably will increase over the next few years as the temperature will decline again. Now, people will also tell you, climatologists, alarmists will tell you that Greenland is melting away, and this is going to raise sea level at a dramatic level. If you look at, for example, the biggest glacier in Greenland, Zacharias Glacier, you can see that between 2012 and 2015, there has in fact been an increase in the amount of ice of that glacier. You can see that on the curves that are displayed there. But the most interesting point is that Greenland gained 225 gigatons of ice more since 2012 to 2016. If it gains ice, it clearly cannot melt away. There have been periods earlier in the 1930s till 1950s where, in fact, people have already recorded the melting of Greenland. And in 1940, for example, the Courier Mail in Brisbane claimed that Greenland was melting so much that we were nearing a catastrophe at that time. Now, what is really sad is not so much that these kind of things happen and have been obviously put under the carpet by alarmist climatologists. What is really sad is how data have been manipulated in order to fulfill their agenda. This is the temperature recorded in Reykjavik. You can see that the temperature went up to the 1940s, down to the 1970s, and up again. After manipulation by NASA, the temperature in the 1940s has significantly been dropped down and increase in the temperature, giving you the feeling of an abnormal temperature increase surfaces and comes out. This is absolutely disgusting. It is no longer science, it is manipulation. As for the dangerous sea level rise, this is what happened about 20,000 years ago. As we leave the last glacial period, the sea level rose dramatically by about 120 meters. Since then, at the beginning, since we reached the beginning of the Holocene, the sea level has been rising steadily by a few millimeters per year, 1 to 2 millimeters per year. If we have a closer look at this dramatic increase, you can see that from 1850 to about 2012, 2013, the slope of the increase has barely changed. If anything, it has slightly slowed down. In red, you have what people nowadays call the catastrophic sea level rise, compared to the natural sea level rise. This is allegedly due to man-made production of CO2. This is due to nature. I cannot foresee any difference in the slope of these two curves. These data have been measured by satellites, and there too show an increase in sea level which is steady and which is in the order of 1 to 2 millimeters per year as far as we can measure these kind of things. Let me finally remind you that carbon dioxide is in fact good for the planet. It is not a poison. Carbon dioxide is food for plants. And our period nowadays is a period in which plants are starving from CO2. They are starving because the level of CO2 is one of the lowest we have encountered in our planet so far. In fact, there were periods when CO2 levels were nearly 20 times higher as the one we have nowadays. What we can see over the past 30 years as monitored by satellite is that planet Earth is greening tremendously. They have been measured 20% greening of our planet, out of which about half is due to the presence of carbon dioxide. Plants need CO2, they need slightly higher temperature, and they will grow better, be harder, and be more resistant if they have that. Even deserts are now shrinking for the sheer reason that they release less water, therefore they can survive under harsher climate conditions. This is a graph showing you how the plant can get bigger and in better health if you increase CO2 level from 285 ppm to 435 ppm. In normal greenhouse, people will actually put in there on purpose about 1200 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and that's the overall amount, the average best amount of CO2 for plant growth. I would like to finish by taking a few words from Richard Feynman, a very nice physicist who said that it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, it doesn't matter how sexy it is, it doesn't matter how appealing it is. If it's wrong, if it doesn't correlate with the hard fact, with the hard data, you just throw it away. And this is exactly what we should do with the IPCC and global warming theory. It doesn't fit with the data, therefore we should not take care of it, we should just get rid of it and go back to good science, measure things, correlate them with something that's correlable, and understand really climate as scientists should understand. Thank you very much for your attention.